Well, howdy, folks. Welcome back to Economics Class live from the backyard. The hag greets you as well. It just dawned on me how many senior breakfast that y'all are not bringing me in the midst of this whole corona thing. So, evidently, come summertime, y'all are going to need to start dropping off breakfast casseroles at my house on Fridays because y'all owe me I don't know. Y'all owe me a bunch of them right now. I was just thinking about that a few minutes ago. So get on that. Sometime in the summer, while you're trying to figure out going to college and all this stuff, remember that you owe me breakfast casserole. Okay. So with that, today we're going to look at a couple of different. We're going to do kind of a chapter in a short period of time here, but we'll do just a couple notes on unemployment and ways of addressing poverty, and then we'll spend a little bit more time dealing with the process of inflation. What does that mean, and what's the big deal with inflation? So of the things that can be major issues in the economy, I think people know that obviously unemployment is one of the major ones, maybe the major one that people are really sensitive to because everyone needs to work to make a living. And there's a couple different ways that you get to a state of high unemployment. So your book talks about there's four types of unemployment, and only a couple of them really concern economists. The others are kind of normal or to be expected. So one is what they call frictional unemployment. Frictional unemployment is basically when people are just between things. That's when there's not like a structural reason why they're unemployed, but they just leave their job because they want to hunt a better one, or maybe they've decided to come out of retirement and search for work. So, because the definition, the unemployment rate is determined by the number of people that are actually hunting for a job. So, if you've actually retired or stopped looking, you're not really counted toward the unemployed. Now, I don't know how they get all those statistics necessarily. But frictional unemployment, not a big deal. That's just a person moving from one gig to another. Um, Seasonal unemployment is unemployment that's linked to seasonal work. So, for instance, if you're a fisherman, there's going to be certain times of the year where you're going to have catches, and certain times of the year where you're not, right? And you're going to have to find something to do in between unless you are able to make a windfall when you can work. Um, Structural unemployment is a little bit more of a problem that macroeconomists would want to work on. So, structural unemployment is the idea that jobs exist, but workers looking for the work don't have the skills for the job. Um, for instance, a lot of rural areas, one of the things we'll struggle with sometimes is you may say that it'd be great if people would invest a lot in here, um, but you don't always have enough people with the right educations and skill sets for, say, a tech job, which is why a tech startup is much more likely to start in San Francisco than it is in old Saluda. Um, and so, uh, so there's certain so that's going to have a certain impact on the employment rate. Now, there's also, some things that people culturally are more equipped to do here than there, right? If you want to find someone with a lot of experience, handling cattle, then you might do better here than if you were to walk through, some trendy, lofty area in some big city, right? So structural unemployment, though, is where there's a problem where there's jobs are available, but they can't actually be filled by people that are actually qualified for the work. And then the fourth type of unemployment is what they call cyclical unemployment, and that is what happens when you're just on the wrong end of the business cycle. And that's what a lot of people are going through right now, as we've had this huge spike in um, unemployment claims. Now, obviously, that's because we were thrown to the bottom of the business cycle, and I think things are going to start looking up here pretty soon. But cyclical unemployment just means you're in that contractionary phase. The lesson that we looked at the other day on the business cycle, there's less because there's less investment, there's less opportunities for new growth, which means that there's fewer people to get hired, which means there's less work to go around. And the whole way that the economy being in a recession affects so many different aspects of the economy because your customers have less money to buy things from you, and so on. So those are some of the different factors that cause unemployment. And of course, one thing that unemployment and its close relative underemployment, which is where people can't find, they can find maybe some work, but they can't find enough work. They need a full-time job, and all they can find are part-time jobs. Unemployment and underemployment are two very important causes of the next issue that we'll look at, which is when we move here to section 2 on page 388 of poverty and income distribution. Again, we're going to be kind of a quick summary of this, and then we'll slow down and talk about inflation a little bit more. So poverty is the condition where a person's income and resources does not allow him or her to achieve a minimum standard of living. One thing that you have to understand when you look at poverty statistics is that poverty is very relative. If all you own was a hut and some goats, we would look at you as being desperately poor. In the United States, there's some other countries where we would look at you as being potentially well-to-do based on how many of those goats that you had, right? So it's hard to come up with an objective measure of poverty and the thing is, if one of the things behind the whole war on poverty idea, if you define poverty as being in the bottom 20% of your nation economically, then even if you gave everyone a huge material increase, you wouldn't have affected the poverty rate because 20% of people are going to make up the bottom 20% by definition. One thing you'll hear a lot of people will talk about when we talk about income inequality and income distribution, you'll hear a lot of people talk about the top 1% have this and that, and they make it sound like you have this kind of permanent class of people that can never lose influence. They'll compare, well, the top 1% had this in 07 and this in 2017, blah, 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 or whatever. The problem with those measurements is there's always going to be a top 1%. The people that make up the top 1% will change because a lot of people will get to that rare air for a minute and then they'll make some bad business decisions and they come back down to earth a little bit and someone will pass them. So there's always going to be a top 1%. There's always going to be a bottom 1%. That's the nature of statistics. It does not necessarily mean that there's been a huge material change for the individual person, because you're not locked. It's not like an old European feudal class system where you're locked into being nobility for the rest of your life. Kind of the American conception of class system that is built around money. I mean, you can just have money come in or go away just on a whim based on business decisions and the way things go. So it's hard to kind of determine where the poverty threshold is as of 2005, which this is probably outdated, but this is when your book was from. They said the poverty threshold for a family of 4 in the United States was $20,000. I can testify that is poor for 4. I can promise you that. You can live off of that as a single person, potentially, but it would be hard to make it on that with mouths to feed. So the poverty rate is the percentage of people living in households that have incomes below the poverty threshold. And the thing is, using national statistics to determine your poverty is actually a little bit questionable too, because the standard of living is very different in different parts of the country. If I took, I'm living, fairly comfortably. I mean, I don't have a ton of leftover after my bills, and there's certain things that, I have to forgo or whatever that other people take for granted or whatever. But I mean, I have a house. You can guarantee I ain't missed meals. I'm able to go out and eat sometimes. I can save up and normally buy myself something good if I want it most of the time. So I'm comfortable. I can get by. If you took my exact salary and moved me to New York City, I'd be broke in no time, right? Because there's a drastically different standard of living. The cost of everything is different. And so obviously you have someone who might be poor in New York, but if they moved to Mississippi, they'd actually be doing okay for themselves, because again, poverty is a very relative type of thing. We have made some dramatic, I don't know, we'll see if this worldwide recession is going to cost us some of these gains, but I could say definitively, if I'd have been teaching this lesson 2 months ago, I'd have said without any hesitation that we've made tremendous strides in undoing what the UN labels as extreme poverty, which is basically $1 a day level of income, which is horrendous. I mean, you can't live off of that. But we've literally cut that in half in a 10-year period going into all of this, and I don't know, it may still hold. I don't know. So what are some factors that cause poverty, that affect the rate of poverty? One is education. Typically, there's a pretty direct relationship between education and income. The more educated you are on average, the more money you're going to make. Now, I've talked before about how there are exceptions to that, and you need to know the field you're going into. It might behoove you to get some kind of technical certification instead of a degree, depending on what you want to go into. But nonetheless, it's always better to improve your human capital, right? And remember that phrase. So, the more education that you have under your belt, I mean, typically you're going to be better off. Discrimination has been a factor historically, probably a little bit less so of a factor than it was once upon a time, thankfully. But there still can be some levels of that. Demographic trends. This is a big one. In the 1950s, about 1/4 of marriages ended in divorce. By the 2000s, when your book's being printed, it was nearly 50%. Over that same period, births from unmarried mothers jumped from 5% of births to 30%. This is a tremendous, tremendous cause of poverty. I'm telling you, I've seen dozens and dozens and dozens of social science studies, research that's been done. It's been proven over and over and over again. One of the best ways to guarantee that your family line does not exist in generational poverty is for everyone in the family to wait until they get married to have children, get married, stay married, work and have a stable family. If you do that, your family is not going to stay poor for generations. Study any area of the country, regardless of racial factors, regardless of religious factors, regardless of anything going into that. If you look at any area that has extreme poverty, you'll notice there's a very high level of family instability, domestic abuse, high divorce rates, unwed mothers. And some of this can be a little bit of it's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing, because obviously people that are in financially stressful situations are maybe more likely to get divorces in the first place, and so on. So, but nonetheless, I think it's been proven over and over and over again that if you can just, get an education, get married, get a job, have children, stay married, and you'll do better than if not. And if your kids are going to do better if you stay married than if you get a divorce. I mean, that's just been proven over and over and over again by social science. So, it's almost impossible to overestimate how important family stability is to ending cycles of poverty. And this is one of the big problems with. Well, hold on. Let me hold what I'm about to say until just a minute. We'll finish looking at this. So, and then the fourth factor of affecting poverty rates is changes in the labor force. If you have, this is some of what we talked about when we just talked about the whole AI thing. When you have certain things making certain jobs unnecessary, that's going to, probably increase the chances of certain groups being in poverty who had depended on a certain, like truckers, for instance. If it comes to a place where all the trucks are self-driving, you're going to have an awful lot of people that are going to be potentially facing a poverty situation because of unemployment over things like that. So what about the question of income distribution or inequality? That is, so the idea of a country with high income inequality is a country where the GDP, it's not, distributed very evenly above the population. So you've got a lot of extremely rich people at the top and extremely poor people at the bottom. There's not much of a middle class. And some people say that this is a tremendous problem. Well, I'm going to say one area where they have a point, and then another area where I'm going to push back on that idea. So where this can be a problem is in uh, just the reality of social situations that if let's see, I'm trying to remember some of these statistics to pull together from things I've read, but I know that this is the case that um, like for instance, is crime more prevalent in impoverished areas? Your first instinct is probably going to be to say yes, but it's not entirely true. It's more likely in areas that are impoverished in countries or areas where there's lots of rich. So if you have, so for instance, the fact that there's poverty in a country where the whole nation is poor doesn't necessarily make it more likely to have theft. But if you've got a region that has a lot of poverty and it's just a few blocks down from a region that has lots of riches, that's kind of where a lot of times you get a recipe for high criminality. So there are certain actual practical disadvantages to having a unequal society. The problem is you just can't really fix it that much other than try to have a good education system and things like that because because when you try to socially engineer a lot of this stuff, you're going to wind up with some of the problems that we'll deal with in just a moment when we talk about how some of how our attempts at welfare and things like that have backfired. So the other thing, so that is like the one area where the income inequality, people have a little bit of a point, is there is some social incohesion that tends to happen. Now, here's the problem. To try to regulate that, you have to basically hinder people's personal freedom. Because if I gave two of you $100 and I said, do with it what you will, I'm going to give you absolute freedom to either spend it or save it or invest it. And one of you said, well, I've got $100. I'm going to go straight to the store and get myself a pair of boots. And then another one said, well, I've got $100. I'm going to save it up and, I'm going to go make an investment because I want to start, investing and get this thing on the side. And then, or you use some of that as seed to start like a business on the side, like maybe you're thinking about, starting a yard work company, and you put that $100 toward a mower or something like that. Okay, well now let me check back, a little while later and see which of you is doing better economically. Well, the person whose instinct was to save and to, to build on what he had is more than likely is statistically much more likely to have succeeded than the one who immediately was like, let me go blow this right away. So if I wanted to, so when you look at that, the maximum freedom of me not telling you what to do with it helped cause an inequality. Now, the flaw in that analogy is that you both started with an equal amount. In reality, people don't start with equal amounts. Some people, are born into rich families. Some people are born into poor families. But the point, nonetheless, remains that if you wanted to, the only way to guarantee equality of income is to guarantee it at virtually zero. And we've learned that through the experience of, the horribly failed communist experiment. And so, ultimately, if as long as there is absolute freedom, people are going to use that freedom for their betterment and in a way that is detrimental to them. And so that's how you're going to wind up with a situation where there's not going to be, equality in that case. So to me, the issue is, it's not the role of the state to have to try to carve out income equality in terms of everyone having the same money. In fact, that would have to be a moral evil because you would have to prevent people from building on what they have. But what is important is to make sure everyone has equality before the law, that everyone has equality of opportunity, that you do certain things like, whether it's having quality education systems or having things like that that help enable people to have a fair shot at improvement. That's kind of where the focus needs to be. Um, One thing that how have we tried to address poverty as a nation? Well, one of the ways we've done it is by throwing a lot of money at relief programs, and obviously we just threw a lot of money at relief programs in the last month or two. Some of which I'm more sympathetic to than I usually would, because it's people who had not made bad business decisions. That could have never expected this to happen. Uh, but we've and So there's a number of ways that we've tried to do things to kind of alleviate poverty. Social Security for retirees, Medicare and Medicaid, which are government health insurance for the elderly and the poor, respectively. I don't know if I may have confused them. Medicare is for the elderly. Medicaid is for the less fortunate. Um, and of course, they actually made it a lot easier to get Medicaid. They moved during with the whole Obamacare bill, so now more people qualify for it than used to. Now there's a lot of middle class people that can fit on there as well. So in all sorts of food stamps, which are where they give you that you can only spend on food, and then TANF, temporary assistance for needy families, which is just direct transfer payments. And so they've given all these things with the attempt of helping alleviate poverty, and it absolutely has helped families in the short run to kind of get by from month to month. But I think over the long term, it's been largely detrimental. A lot of the stuff has been largely detrimental, and the reason for that is because the welfare state kind of creates perverse incentives that then inspire the factors that cause generational poverty to continue. So, for instance, we talked about, and this is what I almost got ahead of myself and talked about this a few minutes ago. One of the biggest predictors of economic success is family stability, having a stable two-parent home. Very difficult to overestimate how important that is. Well, if you have a welfare assistance program of any kind that uh, encourages you, that is more generous to single mothers than it is to married ones, and the logic for why you do that is there's only so much money to spin around. The single ones need it more, right? So in the short term, you think, give it to the single mothers. Well, the problem with that is you've just created an incentive for her not to get married, because now if she gets married, she's losing part of her provision. Um, or with unemployment benefits. Now, obviously, we've got unemployment there was a major temporary expansion of that connected to this whole COVID thing. But one of the problems with unemployment insurance is that you have a situation where, and I just read an article where a restaurant owner was saying that they're really worried that they were overly generous in some of these unemployment emergency benefits that they just rushed out, because she's not sure that her employees will come back because they actually would be losing money. Like she actually got a loan to keep the business running and to keep the paychecks getting paid and not lay people off. And her people were actually mad at her because they thought they were going to get more money by being unemployed than they were going to get for working. Well, that is going to create that's a kind of a perverse incentive. It's you're encouraging what you don't want. And so some of these things have had the negative impact of kind of encouraging people to stay in patterns of decision making that keep their family line, kind of locked in generational poverty, and that's a very real problem. I think one of the now on the other hand, I think there's some people have an overreaction to that, where they kind of don't want to help the poor because, well, they might ought to deserve to be broke or whatever, or like, don't give money to the bum. He did so. Well, the reality is the scripture also tells us that we have to take care of the needs of the poor. That was the original sin of Sodom, was they didn't regard the needs of the poor, according to one of the prophets. I think it was in Ezekiel, and obviously it matriculated into some other things. But that's where it started. Proverbs talks about he who lends to the poor, he who gives to the poor lends to the Lord, and he shall never lack. So it's important that we take care of the poor, but it's also important that we don't push it over on the government. And here's why: because because back in the days when the church as an institution had more of a role in taking care of the poor, they were able to kind of use judgment and common sense a little bit more to help determine who is someone who's trying to take advantage of us and who is someone who's actually legitimately needy and could really use a hand up instead of a hand out. And whereas the government has to set like by the book standards, and the person who's determining it can't decide that he thinks this person is a slacker or not, and so having back in the old days when it was kind of more put on civil society, whether it's the church or private charities or whatever, to do more for alleviating poverty, it kind of helped avoid some of these incentives not to work and so on. Now, the welfare abuse problem was really bad in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, and in the 1990s they passed a very good piece of legislation on a bipartisan basis with the Newt Gingrich Congress, and then President Clinton signed it. That put some limitations on how long you can receive welfare, put certain work requirements, drug testing requirements, things like that, and it improved the situation somewhat. But there's still abuses of it, certainly. And the reality is we're throwing an awful lot of money toward this relief stuff that is fueling a lot of this debt crisis that we'll talk about in a future video. But it's also important to me. You can't confuse not liking liberal economic policies without being generous in your personal life, or feeling like you don't want to give anything to a poor person that because they may have deserved it or whatever, because that's you start to develop an unchristian attitude when you do that. I mean, to me, if there's a bum asking for money, and I have some dollars on me, I'm not going to sit there and say, well, he might buy beer with us. Okay, well, maybe, but I obeyed God in my conscience by giving the money in that situation. It's up to him to decide what to do with it. So, but on the other hand, if for a fact, maybe you've dealt with the person and if you give them money, they're going to go buy heroin with it. Maybe don't, because you can actually hurt someone by unsanctified helping as well. So it's a tough spot sometimes. The best help you can give somebody is to get them a job if you have the capacity to do that. I mean, that's literally the best thing that you could do, or to do something to help prepare them to take a new, to help them improve their job skills. That's almost the best charity that you could give. So that's poverty, income inequality. Now we'll look real quick at inflation and kind of what that means. So what inflation means, and we've talked about this before at different times, but it means a sustained rise in the general price level or fall in the purchasing power of money. So when inflation happens, the dollar that you have buys you less than it once did. And typically the way they gauge inflation is by using something called a consumer price index, which is a theoretical, they use the term basket of certain goods that are considered theoretically necessary, and they try to gauge how much it would cost to actually buy an adequate supply of them at a given time, and then they compare it with how much it would be to buy those CPI goods later on down the road, and that determines what they'll consider the rate of inflation. And of course, inflation has continued pretty drastically, especially since we've come off of the gold standard. And so, literally, I mean, your grandparents, once could have bought loaves of bread for a nickel, and now, it's several dollars. So if you take that same rate of inflation from a nickel to several dollars and apply it to something that would have been 20 grand when they were coming up, and now that thing would probably be, significantly more than that. So, so inflation, is a really big deal. If you could get today's money supply, if you could get like a minimum wage paycheck from today, and then hop in a time machine and go back in time and buy a bunch of stuff, I mean, you could live like a king. Because you would have the dot. Now they might not take your money because they'd see, hey, this bill doesn't look right. Because they've changed the look of all the bills and so forth. But hypothetically speaking, if you were capable of doing that, you know, uh, there's things that once would have been, relatively. Um, well, there's things that the amount of money that you get today would have made you, rich back then if you had that same nominal uh, dollar value. So, and there's along with inflation, hyperinflation is what happens when there's a really sustained rise in inflation, like what happened in the Depression in Germany. But then also the inverse of inflation is what they call deflation, which is where there's a decrease in the general price level, which is that's also not good for the economy. That happened during parts of the Great Depression because people just had to lower the price of goods because no one had money to pay the prices they would have paid a few years ago. So there's kind of two ways that inflation happens. So one is what they call demand pull inflation. And that is that the total demand rises faster than the production of goods and services. So people are buying more than is available. So shortages are coming, which raise the price of the goods that are there. The second kind is what they call cost push inflation. And that is what happens when something changes the cost of making the product. So, for instance, I remember a stretch where some storm had come in and really affected the tomato crop for whatever reason that year. And the price of everything at my favorite Italian place went up because, there wasn't a dish that didn't have tomato products in it, right? So that was cost push inflation, like things were getting more expensive to make. And the government can easily cause cost push inflation to happen by like a bad tariff policy that makes it really expensive to buy steel or something like that. Can affect any business that involves steel. So, and one of the reasons, and we'll talk in a future lesson about the Federal Reserve and how they kind of manage the money supply and how they try to affect inflation. But if the government creates too much money during the lag period before an increase in production makes goods available, there's going to be too much money chasing too few goods, and prices will go up. So that's a way that the government can cause demand pull inflation, is by if they put too much money into the market and there's not enough goods for that money to be spent on, that's going to, or there's too much money chasing too few goods, that's going to help cause inflation. One thing that happens on the other side of cost push inflation, which is often related to supply shocks, like it would happen in the 1970s when OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Companies, that squirrel just scared me. He sounded like he was a much fiercer animal than just a squirrel from the way he was bounding around. So you never know what's out here in these here woods. Hopefully you don't see my death at the hands of a bear on camera. That'd be sad. I haven't made fun of any preacher's bald spots lately. I'm assuming I've told you that story. If not, remind me next time you see me. So OPEC, the oil petroleum exporting countries, limited the amount of oil that they sold to the United States in the 1970s, which caused the price of oil to go up, which also, anytime there's a major increase in the price of oil, that has a bad impact on the cost of everything, because guess how everything you buy got to the store? In a truck. And so if the price of diesel fuel is going through the roof, then so is then for the grocery store or any other store that you're buying things from. I mean, even a restaurant gets their food off of a truck. So even the cafeteria at King gets their food off of a truck. So if they're going to keep profit margins the same, they're going to have to raise prices to make up for the fact that they've had to pay more for it to come in, because the trucking companies probably charged a little bit more to cover the price increases. Yeah. So, in addition, what happens too is when inflation happens, workers start going to the boss and saying, "Hey, this salary was good for 3 years ago, but it doesn't work anymore because prices have gone up." So what happens is they demand raises. Well, the problem is when you give everyone a raise, now the cost of operations have gone up for the business, so they in turn have to raise their prices, which contributes to the overall inflation level. So this causes a wage cost spiral, where, as inflation happens, it encourages businesses to pay people more, which in turn fuels prices going up, because those companies need to recoup that new salary in profit some other way. So that's why, prices tend to go up over time. That's why, you're never going to go back to, I mean, of course, I never thought you'd go back to $1.50 gasoline after it was $4 10 years ago, but, you're never going to go back to getting a loaf of bread for a nickel, because, Wonder Bread has to pay the factory workers more than they used to back in the day, because everyone else's bread is more expensive than it used to be. So because of that, prices for everything are going to continue to climb, but also wages are going to climb with that. The problem for people is the wages don't, sometimes there's a gap between when the inflation happens and when the raise in wages happens. So now jobs that would have been $10 an hour jobs 20 years ago are now mainly $14 an hour jobs, and so on, because they've tried to keep up with inflation. But there's a gap period between when wages rise and so on that oftentimes results in people having temporary periods of struggling more and having less discretionary income, meaning they can determine what they want to do with it. So what are some of the impacts of inflation? What is the real? So you might ask, well, what's the real problem with inflation if people's wages go up to meet it? What's bad about it? Well, here's some of the problems. One thing is the decreasing value of the dollar means that every dollar that let's say that you have $500 in your account. Well, if there's if it just sits there for a year and there's a 10% inflation rate, then you haven't lost any money on paper, but in reality you've lost $50 of purchasing power from your money just sitting there. And that was most dramatically seen in Germany in the Weimar Republic years between the world wars, where there was such a hyperinflation crisis that people were literally getting piles of money in wheelbarrows and going straight to the market to buy their goods, because if they waited to the end of the day, they would have lost a percentage of the purchasing power. Also, think about it. Let's say that you're on a fixed income. Like, for instance, you're a retiree. Let's put yourself in your grandpa's shoes. You haven't worked in 10 years. You're living off of Social Security and a stipend from retirement from, wherever you retired, there's not a whole lot of other things that you can do. You're not likely, if you decided you want to go back to work, it might be hard to get work because your health isn't great. Well, what do you do when you're on a fixed income of so many dollars a month, and then the price of all your basic needs goes up? The answer is pain. The answer is it hurts, and people live less comfortably. Your book gives an example of a theoretical college student who he starts college with a savings of $10,000 to see him through, which more power to him if he has 10 grand in savings by the time he's 18. You go that guy. But in this case, he kind of budgeted out $2,500 a year, thinking this is going to work. Well, but the problem is, because of inflation, by the time he was a senior, he actually needed $2,750 instead of $2,500, because over that 4-year period, the actual cost of goods had gone up, and what he budgeted for at the beginning wasn't going to be good enough. So, I mean, that is a factor. One thing about it, though, is that inflation can actually help borrowers. So, which is why there have been a handful of movements in American history, most notably the Free Silver movement, and was connected to the Midwestern Prairie populism of William Jennings Bryan in the 1870s, 80s, 90s. a lot of what they wanted is they actually wanted inflation, because inflation is actually good for people who are in debt. It's bad for people who have loaned money. It's good for people who have borrowed money. And the reason for that is, let's say that you've gone to the bank and you borrowed, let's say you borrowed $100 at 5% interest, meaning you're going to owe the lender $105 after a year. If inflation rises at 5%, you're going to pay back $105, but it's going to have the same purchasing power as if you just paid them back the principal, and so you functionally paid no interest on your loan. Does that make sense? So because the interest payment has less purchasing power than it would have, you actually paid less interest in terms of real dollars, and so the borrower got less of a deal if he thought he was going to live off of his interest and it was going to make lending that money worth it. Inflation caused that loan to not really profit him anything. So what are borrowers going to do in that situation? Well, here's where we get to another problem. So because of that, people that lend money, like banks, know that if they lend money in a period where inflation is moving up at too quick of a rate, that they're going to lose a lot of the value of their loan. So what they're going to do is they're going to raise the interest rates. So if they expect 5% inflation, they're not going to give you 5% interest rates. They're going to charge you 7 or 8%. So they're making sure they're making real purchasing power money, real profit off of it after inflation. Well, what that means is it's harder to get a loan, because if you're taking a loan at a higher interest rate, you're going to have a higher monthly payment and so on. So it's harder to buy houses, it's harder to buy cars, it's harder to buy capital to start up a business, and so that helps to slow economic growth. So when inflation starts to hit the economy, you've got, on one hand, you've got people on fixed incomes who are really squeezed. You've got people whose savings now profit them less. So you've worked really hard saving up. The hyperinflation comes in and goes to the roof, and now you've functionally lost a lot of your savings in terms of real purchasing power. Borrowers can't really make a profit off of the loans they already made in anticipation of profit, and so then as a result, people have a harder time getting new loans, which means anytime there's difficulty getting loans, there's going to be difficulty starting new businesses or expanding businesses, which means there's going to be a freeze in hiring, which can, probably because less construction, less opening up new locations. You've got a restaurant and you need a loan to open a third location, but you don't fool with it because the interest rates are too high, and so now that's 6 waiters and 4 cooks who don't get hired, right? So it begins to play into the unemployment ratings. Obviously, unemployment then is one of the main direct causes of poverty, because people can't find work, and so they don't have enough to eat. And again, this is how a lot of recessions involve inflation as a major factor. And then the third thing, I mentioned this in the midst of that, but I didn't spell out enough. The third factor is it makes savings less fruitful. So you having saved a certain amount of money, if a wave of inflation comes in, you're saving. Maybe you'd set aside $1,000 in 2020 money, but let's say there's a wave of inflation by 2025, and you need to take that out of savings to use it, and you actually only have $800 of 2020 money. It's still $1,000 on paper, but in terms of what it'll actually get you, it's less than it would have been. And so this is one of the reasons why you generally want to work towards slow inflation if you're someone who has a role in managing government economic policy. So anyway, that's it for today. Y'all have yourselves a good one.